Wonders of the Invisible World by Patricia A. McKillop. Introduction, Charles D. Lent. If you want to know who Patricia McKillop is, just read her stories. Really, all we need to know about the creative individuals who fill our lives with poetry, prose, music, and art is waiting for us right there in the work itself. But we're always curious, aren't we? When something moves us, we almost need to know more about the individual who was able to wake us with such a reaction. It can be a double-edged sword, of course. Sometimes the person is everything we hoped they would be, with a heart beating in their chest as big and generous as we imagined, their eyes so clear and wise that it seems utterly appropriate that they give us a profound experience on the world's mysteries. Other times a person is so wrong in the terms of how we imagine them, that we can no longer engage in their art the same way that we once did. It's a curious thing, but even when we know that it might turn out badly, we still walk into the riddle. That is, the artists whose work we admire so much, hoping for the best. The truth is, more often than not, despite their spark of genius, these artists are not unlike you or me. A mix of good and bad, patient and intolerant, welcoming and private, all in varying degrees, and of course, we're all different depending on the day and the situation in which we find ourselves. So I can't tell you who the real Patricia McKillop is. All I can tell you is who she is to me. Like most of you, I first met her in the pages of one of her books. For me, it was The Forgotten Beast of Eld. I remember it was the Avon paperback edition that came out in the mid-70s, which means I've been reading her for around 35 years. I adored that book. When The Riddle Master of Heed came out a year later or so, I became completely smitten. When I went looking for her, I was surprised to discover that her novels came out first in hardcover as young adult books, then they were reprinted as adult paperbacks. I tracked them all down, and to this day, I always pick up her new books. If you're reading this, you know why. They're just so damn good. She's one of those few writers I've read who hasn't written a bad book. I don't think she has it in her. For all that I love the secondary worldly novels for which she is best known, my favorite book of hers is probably Stepping from the Shadows, a standalone contemporary book that contains the idea of fantasy more than actual trappings. Note to self, it's time to reread that book. The first time I actually met Pat was at one of her New England World Fantasy conventions, where I asked her to sign my advanced reading copy, that self-same, Stepping from Shadows. I remember her being so soft-spoken and charming, and a little aghast that I had bought an expensive ARC in the dealer's room, when I had already owned a copy of the book, but I didn't have the hardcover with me, and I really wanted a personalized book to bring home as a treasure. And ever since, I continued to see her at World Fantasy conventions whenever we both happened to attend. Through the years, these cons have become the only place where I can spend time with people I don't normally see, writers, artists, editors, and readers from different parts of the continent, and the world. Gather in a hotel in some major city, well, mostly sit around the hotel bar and schmooze with each other. One particular afternoon, in one of those hotel bars remains a fond memory of me sitting around a large table with Pat, Terry, Windling, Marjorie Snyder, as we went through a big stack of Brian Vaughan's art. Choosing the pieces that would appear in the books, we would write a series called Brian Vaughan's Fairylands. Sadly, only 2 of those books came out with their planned illustrated form. My, The Wild Wood, and Pat's lovingly Something Rich and Strange. I'm not sure why the series was canceled. Terry's The Wood Wife and Midori's Hannah Garden were published. How could 2 such fine books not be published? But it would have been much nicer to have illustrated quartet all be available as originally intended, represently, but with Brian's art. In another world, I'm sure that happened. We're simply not privy to it. What I remember most of that afternoon as we were choosing the art was how there were no arguments, gentle or otherwise. We each just kept picking the illustrations we wanted, and there was no overlap. We delighted in each other's choices, but were completely satisfied with what we got for our own books. And that's how I know Pat, outside of her stories. Every time I've seen her at a World Fantasy convention, she remains soft-spoken, charming, gracious, and articulate, and a little shy, too. Or is that just me? Still smitten with one of my literary heroes after all these years. If you need to know more, turn to the reprint of her 2004 WisCon Guest of Honor speech at the end of this collection, which will give you a taste of her life outside her books. Though really, as I said earlier, you're best off to dive right into the stories collected here. They might be a surprise to you because she doesn't always write gentle fantasies, with which she's usually associated with her contemporary settings, which are a little bit more of a darker edge, are perfect contrast to her gentler fantasies. She does both very well. Charles Lint, Ottawa, Kanawha, Spring 2012. Chapter 1. I am the angel sent to Cotton Mather. It took me some time to get his attention. He lay on the floor with his eyes closed. He prayed fervently, sometimes murmuring, sometimes shouting. Apparently the household was used to it. I heard footsteps pass his study door. A woman, his wife, Abigail, called to someone. If your throat is no better tomorrow, we'll have Philip pee in a cup for you to gargle. From the way the house smelled, Philip didn't bother much with his cups. Cotton Mather smelled of smoke, sweat, and wet wool. Winter had come early. The sky was black, the ground was white, the wind pitched like a switch and whined like a starving dog. There was no color in the landscape and no mercy. Cotton Mather prayed to see the invisible world. He wanted an angel. "Oh, Lord," he said in desperation, hoarse, weary cadence like a sick child talking itself to sleep. "Thou hast given angelic visions on thy innocent children, to defend them from their demons. Remember thy humble servant, who prostrates himself in dust, vile worm that I am, forsaken food and comfort and sleep, in humble hope that thou might bestow upon thee humble servant a blessing and hope at this harsh evil time, a glimpse of thy shadow, a flicker of thy light, in thine eye, a single word of thy mouth. Show me thy messengers of God, who fly between the visible and invisible worlds. Grant me, O God, a vision." I cleared my throat a little. He didn't open his eyes. The fire was dying down. I wondered who replenished it, and if the sight of the Mather's bright, winged creature would surprise anyone, with all the witches and devils and demented goldfinches pierced on rafters all over the New England. The fireside spilling across the wide planks glowed just beyond his outstretched hand. He lay dim in the lights, a fluttering shadow in a long, long night of history when no one could ever see clearly after sunset, and witches and angels in living dreams trembled just beyond the fire. "Grant me a vision, O God." I was standing in front of his nose. He was lost in days of fasting and desire, trying to conjure an angel out of his head. According to his writings, what he had expected to see was a generic white male, with wings growing out of his shoulders, fair-haired, prematurely beardless, wearing a long white nightgown and gold dinner plate on his head. This is what intrigued Daram, and why he had hired me. He couldn't believe that both good and evil in a Puritan imagination could be so banal. But I was what Mather wanted, something as colorless and as pure as snow, that lay on the hand of God over the earth, harsh, exacting, ambiguous, fire, their salvation against the cold, was red, and belonged to hell. "Oh, Lord." It was the faintest of whispers. He was staring at my feet. They were bare and shining and getting chilled. The ring of diamonds in my halo contained controls of light for holograms like my wings, a map disc, a local historical disc, in case I got totally bewildered by the events, and a recorder disc that caught me in a sudden stammer at Matthew's last word. He asked for an angel. He got an angel. I wished he would quit staring at my feet and throw another log on the fire. He straightened slowly, pushing himself off the floor while his eyes traveled upward. He was scarcely 30, and at the time of the trials. He resembled his father at the age more than a familiar Pelham portrait of Mather in his 60s, soberly dressed, with a wig-like cream puff of hair on his head, and a firm, resigned mouth. A young Mather had looked long, dark hair, a spare, handsome, clean-shaven face, searching, credulously eyes. His eyes reached my face, finally, cringing a little, as if he half expected a demon's red, leering face attached to an angel's body. But he found what he expected, and began to cry. He cried silently so I could speak. His writings are mute about much of Angel's conversations, mostly predicted Matthew's success as a writer, great reviews, and spectacular sales in America and Europe. I greeted him, gave him the message from God, quoted Ezekiel, and then got down to business. By then he had stopped crying, wiped his face with his dusty sleeve, and cheered up at the prospect of fame. "There are troubled children," I said, "who have seen me." "They speak of you in their misery," he said gratefully. "You gave them strength against the evil." "Their afflictions are terrible." "Yes," he whispered. "You have observed their torments?" "Yes." "You have taken them into your home, bore witness to their complaints, tried to help them cast out their tormentors?" "I have tried." "You have wrestled with the invisible world?" "Yes." We weren't getting very far. He knelt to the floor, as he had done for hours, perhaps days. He could see me more clearly than he had seen anything in his dark life. He had forgotten the fire. I tried to be patient. Good angels were beyond temperament, even while at war with angels who had disgraced themselves by exhibiting human characteristics. But the floorboards were getting cold. "You have felt the invisible chains about them," I brooded. "The invisible hellish things moving beneath their bedclothes?" "The children cannot seem to stand my books," he said a little curiously, with a worried frown. "My writing sends them into convulsions. At the mere act of opening my books, they fall down as dead upon the floor. Yet I can lead them gently back to God's truth, if the act of such violence was against them." "It's not against them," I reminded him, "but against the devil who," I added, "inspired to take many shapes." He nodded and became voluble. "Last week he took the shape of thieves who stole 3 sermons from me, and a rat, or something like a hellish rat. We could feel the air, but not see." "A rat?" "And sometimes a yeller bird. The children say they see it perched on the fingers of those they name witches." "And since they say it, it is so?" He nodded gravely. "God made nothing more innocent than children." I'll let that pass. I was his delusion, and if I had truly been sent to him by God, then him and God agreed on everything. "Have they," this was Durham's suggestion, "not yet seen the devil in the shape of a horse? A black horse who spews fire between its teeth and is ridden by 3 witches, each more beautiful than the last?" He stared at me, then caught himself imagining the 3 witches and blinked. "No," he breathed. "No one has seen such a thing, though the shape of godly bishop and her scarlet bodiance and her lace has been seen over the beds of honest married men." "And what did she do to them?" "She hovered, she haunted them. For this she was hung." For wearing a color and enticing the imagination, she was hung. I refrained from contentment that since her shape had done the hovering, it was her shape that should have been hung. But it was almost worth my researcher's license. "In God's justice," I said piously, "her soul dwells." I had almost forgotten the fire. This drearily crazed, malicious atmosphere was more chilling than the cold. "She had a witch mark," Mather added, "the witch's teat." His eyes were wide, marveling he had conjured witches as well as angels out of his imagination. I suppose it was easier in the harsh world to make demons of your neighbors than to find their perfections. They have their imperfections, tempers, rummy eyes, missing teeth, irritating habits and smells. Then it was easier to do that than find the angelic beauty in them. But I wasn't here to judge. I could hear Durham's intense voice. Imagination. Imagery. I wanted to know what they pulled out of their heads. They invented their devil, but all they could do was make him talk like a bird. Don't bother with a moral viewpoint. I want to know what Mather saw. This was the man who believed that thunder was caused by sulphurous farts of decaying vegetation. Why? Don't ask me. You're a researcher. Go research.